What's up mates, it's Uncle Nightshift again, and I must say we're getting pretty close to the finish line with this model. So far we applied some filters, oil dots, washes, fake shadows and highlights, chipping, rust effects, and we also painted all those small details like tools and the exhaust. Tonight we're gonna do a lot of work because we need to apply some mud and dust effects. And before we begin, I'll try pronouncing this tank's name, so... Panzerkleinzerstörer Rutscher. Alright my friends, so we need to apply a lot of effects across the entire surface, including the wheels and lower hull, back plate, also the front plate offers some interesting possibilities, and of course we can't forget about idlers and sprockets. But before we begin, let's keep in mind how this tank looks with the tracks attached. See how they protrude from under those fenders? That would have been a serious design flaw if this tank was ever built, because those large studs on tracks would throw up tons of mud, which, considering this machine's tiny size and expected top speed of up to 60 km per hour, would mean it would be completely covered in mud. We're not gonna go that far, but let's keep it in mind. Things like this can have a huge impact on how natural or unnatural the model looks once finished. So let's start with some muddy texture. As always, I'm gonna put my trust into Wilder's Textured Earth, which is an acrylic paste. I usually find it easiest to start on the lower hull, especially behind the wheels, because first, this is where most mud would collect, and second, if something doesn't work as intended, it'll be mostly hidden. In this case it will be completely hidden, but yeah, you get the point. This paste dries very fast because it's acrylic. But if we work swiftly and in small sections, we'll have plenty of time to blend it with tap water. Honestly, I think this creates pretty sick results. Another thing which I find very important is choosing the correct dust or dry mud color for German yellow. I'm sure at least some of you who already weathered a tank painted in this color will know exactly what I'm talking about. The paint is very similar to the dust or dry earth, so we must choose a more grayish earth tones which will be clearly visible and easy to distinguish from the tank's base color. Although in this case we're gonna completely repaint this layer of mud, because right now we're just creating texture and volume, but still, it can already tell us if we're going in the right direction. And one more important thing is to be careful and not apply too much mud in the wrong places, because suddenly you might find yourself unable to attach the wheels or tracks. And I can tell you from my own experience, it's not pleasant at all. Well, anyway, with the lower hull textured, I'd say we're off to a good start. Even though most of it won't be visible, but still, it's a nice feeling, you know. Let's move on to the back plate and fenders. This is where mud would fly up from moving tracks, and if this tank was moving on soft ground, this section would be totally buried under a layer of mud and earth. I want to achieve something that's somewhere in the middle, like, for example, the tail light would be definitely sprayed with mud, but at the same time I think the crew would want to keep it somewhat clean so it can still serve its purpose. This, for example, is a good place where we can create a smooth transition between the muddy parts and clean surface. As such, I only applied a small amount of paste and blended it with lots of water. And here on the back plate, basically the same story, but I was even more careful because the mud would mostly fly in a straight line towards the front of the tank, and only small amounts would be splattered sideways. And wheels, well, wheels are also quite specific. Here I decided to apply heavier amounts on the rearmost wheel and then add less and less towards the front. I also concentrated the mud around corners and crevices where it would naturally stay in place. As most of you know, I glued them together for easier handling, but the outer wheels are removable for better access. Because of that, I had to be careful and avoid applying too much mud, because again, it would make assembling them impossible. Anyway, because I had a ton of fun with static grass and real earth on the previous model, I decided to give it a shot on this one as well. So I prepared some static grass, earth from my garden, and a few strands from a sea ball. It's literally a ball from the sea, and it can be found at the beach, I guess. So I started by depositing small amounts of earth into corners because there's a higher chance it would stay in place here and not fall off like immediately. Also, you can see that I'm mostly using the finest, almost dust-like earth. That makes me sound like some dirt snob. I only use the finest dirt. Anyway, then I pushed it into place with a paintbrush, and I just played around with it for a while until I was happy with the result. I added a few larger chunks here and there, and of course some natural fibers from the sea ball and some static grass as well. This should all represent loose dirt mixed with roots, tree branches and grass, just a lot of mess. And then I fixed it in place with AK's gravel and sand fixer, which is a sort of lacquer-based glue or something. It basically does the same job like PVA glue mixed with water, but it has lower surface tension so it flows much better and it partially melts the paint underneath for a while, which means the loose dirt will become a permanent part of the model. Well, not entirely permanent, because enamel thinner can dissolve it, so it's better to be careful while blending enamels on top of it, but we'll get to that in a moment. So, I'd say the texturing part is over and all I wanted to add is in place, so now I think it's time to start applying some dust and dry earth tones. This time I decided to use Tamiya acrylics for pre-dusting. I mixed them in about 1 part dark grey and 9 parts buff to get a color which is very similar to one of the weathering products that I'm gonna use in a moment. And yes, I'll apply it with an airbrush. The reason this method is called pre-dusting is because it usually serves just as a base layer or foundation for the actual dust, which is applied with a paintbrush. It helps us establish some basic, volume. What I'm trying to say is that by airbrushing the dust paint in specific parts, you outline areas where most earth tones will be concentrated, so when you're blending enamel dust tones for example, you'll have a solid matte foundation. It also helps to subtly blend the textured earth and loose debris, and let's not forget the biggest benefit, it's efficient and fast. We can also use a piece of paper to mask individual panels and thus create contrast between them. One thing to keep in mind here is that less is better, because it's pretty easy to get carried away. Basically, you should always remember that there are a few more layers of dust coming on top of this one, so the pre-dusting should only make up about 25% of the entire weathering. This is a very old technique and I haven't used it in a few years, but I wanted to give it a shot and honestly, I don't know why I stopped using it. I mean, technically, it's one more technique to use and thus more work, but on the other hand, it makes the whole weathering process much more efficient and truth be told, I spent less time weathering this model than I would without it. And also by looking at it, I'd say it looks quite presentable, and if someone decided that this is enough, I wouldn't say a single word. But like I said, this is just the foundation for the next step, aka Aqualine Dry Earth from Wilder. This is also an acrylic product, and it is also quite thick, but it can be diluted and reactivated with water, which means we can apply it and blend just like oil paints or enamels, but with water. Not to mention, this is one of the easiest paints to work with. Seriously, and this is no advertisement, but I just can't recommend it enough. No matter how much you slap it on the model, once you blend it, it'll look good. Like, yeah, this is looking pretty wild, but don't worry. Like I said, it can be reactivated, and what this means in practical life is that we can blend it pretty much at any time, even a month after it has dried. So, if you for example create your dust effects and the next day you realize that it's just too much, just take a brush and some water and fix it to your liking. Also, this paint is completely matte and it actually has this like microscopic texture. It's very similar to what you'd achieve if you mixed regular enamel dust paint with pigments. It's a little bit hard to describe, but in the end it doesn't look just like a dust-colored paint. It looks like an actual dust that has been scaled down. It's because the paint has higher pigment content and the grain is also slightly heavier, and when you're mixing it in your palette, you can actually hear the pigments crunching against the metal. Well, anyway, enough talking about the paint. Like you most likely figured out, I'm using the previously airbrushed dust layers as a guide. But I'm also blending the aqualine dust more towards the clean parts of the model, which makes the color transition more natural. Also, by gently tapping the surface, I'm creating a mottled and gritty effect, which is also more authentic than super smooth airbrush transition from the previous step. Anyway, I needed some more texture in a few specific places, and for this I had to use enamel paints, because these won't react with the aqualine dust. I picked these because I had to mix a similar tone to the one I already applied. The ratio is 1 part earth and about 4 parts dry earth. This mixture was speckled on the back of the tank because, like I already mentioned, this is where mud would fly up from the tracks. Speckling also complements the blended textured earth, and it makes a pretty nice and gnarly transition from those sides covered in mud to those rather clean portions under the exhaust. Any unwanted specks are easily removed with small amount of enamel thinner. If I used aqualine for this step, I would be reactivating the layer underneath, which is obviously something I didn't want. So, the dry layer is now done, and we actually created 2 effects with one technique. Both dry mud and dirt, like on the lower hull and fenders, and dust on the upper surfaces. Because I used enamel paints on the back, I had to leave the model dry overnight, but otherwise I could continue straight away. Oh, and I also speckled some of the enamel mixture on the wheels and lower hull, but just a little, like just so I could sleep more peacefully. Now it's time to make some darker damp earth effects. This paint seems just right for the task. It also has the right consistency, so I could apply straight from the bottle. Painting these darker earth tones can feel a little intimidating at first, and I don't mean your first time, but every time on each model. It definitely feels like that for me, and yes, every single time. So what I do to overcome my hesitation is to start on the most muddy parts, which are also gonna be mostly out of sight. I focus it into crevices and around large details, and also some of those clumps of textured earth can be a great guide, especially when you need to paint some darker stains in the center of each panel. The underside of the fender is another great place to gain your confidence, because this area should be definitely muddy, but at the same time, nobody will ever see it. And then of course it's time to blend it all with enamel thinner. You can see far in the distance that I applied the paint over the entire side, so yeah, there's plenty of time to work with it. This is usually the way I proceed. I apply the paint over a specific location or part of the model, and by the time I'm done it's mostly dry to the touch, so I can start blending it. The enamel thinner won't react with the acrylic dust and dry mud layers applied previously, and the speckled enamel dry mud had about a day to dry, so it should be okay. I also find blending to be more enjoyable than applying the mud, because when I'm applying it, it feels like I'm ruining the model. But while blending, it suddenly feels like, yeah, this is actually gonna be good. Anyway, to make the effect more gritty and to save some time, I applied more mud with the speckling technique. It's always best to apply the mud with the paintbrush first and only then add speckling, because if the process was reversed, you'd wipe most of the speckling away while blending. Okay, I didn't spend time adding mud on those parts which will be hidden behind the wheels, but yeah, at this point I was confident to continue on the rest of the model. Road wheels were probably the most enjoyable part. Again, I followed the same rule as before, so the largest amounts of mud are on the back wheels. The previously applied layers of textured earth and the dry earth tones also serve as a guide, like I see there's already a huge amount of dry mud here, so I add an equal amount of dark mud. Also on smaller parts such as these, it's important to make sure you won't cover the entire piece while blending the paint. So there still should be visible portions covered with dry mud, and also parts which are relatively clean. That's probably the thing some of you might have in mind. Why did I spend so much time painting those wheels, like adding chipping effects, rust zones and so on? Well, most of the time it's hard to predict how the weathering is gonna look, so it's better to take your time with stuff like chipping and so on. And if you look closely, there's still some of that visible in a few places, which creates a pretty complex finish. Anyway, I also speckled some more mud on them just like on the lower hull, and again more speckles towards the back and less at the front. The outer wheels were speckled separately so I could have more control over the effect, and any large speckles were blended with the wheels already assembled. With the running gear complete, it's time to move on to the upper hull. This is gonna be more of a review of the same method, so I'll try to keep it brief. On fenders, I concentrated the damp mud into corners and over layers of textured earth, and also over the loose dirt. Here I had to be extra careful while blending it because, like we already know, enamel thinner can soften the gravel and sand fixer, which I used to hold the dirt in place. So I had to blend the mud by gently tapping the nearby surface without touching the debris. And also following the same principle like on the wheels, I added less of the effect towards the front. Some extra speckling was employed at the back plate to make the effect look more finished. And again, any unwanted specks were quickly removed with enamel thinner. Small amounts of mud were also blended on the upper surfaces. You can also use all these different earth effects to create further contrast between details and different panels. One more interesting fact is that these ammo splashes and mud paints have similar texture like Wilder's Aqualine products. You can also feel some heavier grains of pigment here, and if you apply it in a thicker layer over a smooth surface, it will have this barely noticeable gritty texture. So it's again not just mud colored paint, but more like scaled down miniature mud. Well, okay, I think that's all I have for now, and man, we did a lot of work tonight. Earth effects are always very intimidating for me because at the beginning I always feel like I'm ruining all the previous work, but then towards the end I'm usually having a lot of fun. It's just the fact that suddenly you start to cover the previous effects like washes and chipping, you know, but it's just the way it is. I find it hard to imagine working like, oh, this corner is gonna be covered with mud and dirt anyway, so I won't waste my time adding washes, blending oils and painting small chips there. It just doesn't work like that for me. Anyway, we still need to paint the tracks and assemble the running gear, and there's also a bunch of those tiny finishing touches like grime and fuel stains and polished metal effects, so I don't know if I'll wrap it up in the next episode or I'll make a separate video just for the tracks. I guess we'll see next week. In the meantime, I wanna say a big thank you to my patrons who make this weekly show possible. If you'd like to contribute as well and in return get some small but tasty rewards, like almost daily blog style updates with photos from my workbench or 1 week early videos, then consider checking it out. You'll be also able to message me directly, so we can also chat about anything you'd like. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say, so thank you all for watching, I wish you an amazing weekend, and I'll see you mates in the next one. And now some bloopers. That would have been a serious design Tonight we're gonna do... Tonight... And expected top speed of up to 60 kilometers per both dry and